Hello, thank you for being here today. My name is Michelle Thorne, and I'm the Executive Director of Care for the Caregivers. Today, we're going to talk about the importance of caring for the caregivers by strengthening families using the Protective Factors framework. But before we get into the training, I just want to talk a little bit about what we do at Care for the Caregivers. We provide support in the form of community events, support group, access to life coaches. We also we also host a lot of different events out in the community, such as Caregiver Night Out. We offer free tickets to the Phoenix Symphony and to the Arizona Opera. And our whole mission is to make sure that the caregiver is also taken care of and not forgotten in this process. And that's what we're asking you all to do, especially those of you who work for organizations and work directly with caregivers. We would like organizations to take a more holistic approach when working with families who are raising children with disabilities and ensure that the whole family is being supported, not just the child with the disability. And that's what the basis is of our talk today. So we'll just do a brief introduction. Gabby, go ahead.
Yep. Hi, everyone. My name's Gabby. I am the Vice President at Care for the Caregivers and a licensed therapist. As a woman with a disability myself, bringing this information to you guys is really important to me. I've dedicated my career to helping families who are raising kids with disabilities, and we're really trying to help you guys sort of reframe how you look at the experience and get more support for yourselves along the way. So we are able to bring this training to you guys today. As Michelle said, it's um, we adapted the Protective Factors framework through a grant that we received in partnership with Prevent Child Abuse Arizona, and it's part of the Flourishing Families curriculum. So we adapted it so that the disability community was specifically considered and that what you guys go through on a daily basis could be applied to the information.
Awesome. So this framework was developed in 2003 by the Center for the Study of Social Policy. And it's a strength-based initiative that is designed to prevent child abuse and neglect, and doing this by strengthening families. And like Gabby said, we have taken this framework and we have infused it with examples of how having a child diagnosed with a disability can alter parents' protective factors and what organizations need to do to make sure that those parents feel supported throughout this process. So what we want to do is we want to see four main outcomes, right? We want to help organizations strengthen families by building up their protective factors through this training. We want to give organizations the framework, and we're also going to give you tools. So we're not just going to talk about the theory of what this framework is, but if you come and have us do continuing education with your organization, we're actually going to give you the tools so you can implement the theory in practice. And we also want to help organizations embrace disability pride and disability culture. I am the mother of two kids who have been diagnosed with autism, and I can tell you that not all organizations do this. And we would like to see that shift and see pride in disability and make sure that we are putting that positive attitude out into the world and to our children too. Overall, what this should all do is reduce the likelihood of abuse and neglect within the homes and strengthen families and produce better outcomes for children who have disabilities.
So this is to give you an outline of the 5 protective factors that we're going to go over. We're going to go over each one individually. So we're going to cover parental resilience, knowledge of parenting and child development, concrete support in times of need, social and emotional competence, and then we'll finish out with social connections.
And then just to touch base on this, each of these trainings are about 2 hours long when we break it down and do individual in-depth trainings in these fields. They're about 2 hours long, and you guys can get continuing education credits for doing this training with us. The first one we're going to go over is parental resilience. And what we would like to instill is this notion that you all, people who work in organizations that directly work with caregivers, you have a big impact on parental resilience and whether or not parents have a positive or negative view about their child's disability and how they handle and cope with that over time. So we just want to point out that how you look, think, and talk about disability is really important to how parents see their disabled child and what their disabled child is capable of. So why do parents become less resilient over time when they get a diagnosis? If you think about things that fill up your life, right? You have family, you have friends, you might have a career that you love. You might love going on vacation. You might love doing events in the family. You might like to just curl up with a book at home and relax. But when parents have a kid diagnosed with a disability, very often this leads to a lot of isolation. Very often our families don't know how to cope with us having a child with a disability, so we lose a lot of our family that we used to rely on. Friends really don't get it. I can tell you, my husband and I have lost about 8 different friendships over the last 10 years because they didn't know how to cope with our children or how to cope with how we changed because our children were diagnosed with a disability. I had to give up my career just as an example. I was a geneticist before all of this started, and I had to walk away from that to take my child to therapies and doctor's appointments. And that just leads to increased isolation. So if you are working with caregivers and you're like, oh my God, these caregivers are stressed out, I can tell you they absolutely are. And that when you have a child diagnosed, it's not one little thing that changes in your life, it's a lot of things that change in your life. And so they're not just coping with a diagnosis, but they're changing, they're also dealing with lots of changes with the people around them, the path they thought they were on, and this sense of isolation that they're kind of in this alone. And I think that that's really where a lot of these organizations like yours can come in and provide avenues to show them that they're not alone and that there is a community here and that everything will be okay. Because it's not what we face and what we see in the very beginning of having a child diagnosed with a disability. So during this parental resilience course, we talk about what resiliency is, understanding where parents are and why building up parent resiliency is so important. We'll share with you ways that you can help to build up parental resilience. And we also do a lot of talking here about disability pride and culture and how to use strength-based language, how to walk away from ableist language, and how to present disability in a way that isn't scary or frightening or seen as bad to caregivers that you're working with. Because all of those messages, positive messages about disability, will help strengthen that parent's resiliency. And then what we do at the end is we help you create a plan for your organization to continue to bolster parent resiliency over time.
The next protective factor that we're going to take a look at is knowledge of parenting and child development. So for this one, why is this important? Why is it vital for parents to have this knowledge of how their child is going to develop? Parents who can have this basic knowledge are more likely to have realistic expectations for their children, and they're able to set more realistic goals. Now, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the next slide, but I just want to point out that when I say realistic expectations, most of the time, 9 times out of 10, I mean higher ones than they're setting currently for their children with disabilities. Because oftentimes a disability diagnosis leads parents and providers like yourselves to lower the expectation for what we want to expect from that kiddo. So we want to try to reverse those. So when we look at this in terms of disability, right, it's a whole different knowledge set, right? Your Depending on the diagnosis, the disability is going to affect each child in a different way, but they don't know how from the beginning that disability is going to affect the ability to reach developmental milestones. So, what I like to point out here is that in the beginning, it can be really helpful for organizations like yours to go in with the mindset that they are going to reach those milestones, even if they look a little different. So we can adapt the way that we do it, but we don't have to take it off the table. Because what we want to do is not contribute to the parents' limiting beliefs about their child's abilities because of their diagnosis. We can stop the child from reaching their full potential. And so that's where you guys come in and giving them this knowledge and the knowledge that's based in that disability pride, as opposed to the medical model that just looks at their limitations. So in this module, we will really take a look at understanding the mental state that a lot of parents are in, why it's important for them to have this knowledge, why it's different when your child is diagnosed with a disability and what those differences mean. We're going to sort of look at how parents pick up their parenting habits and decipher that, explore different ways that you can help parents. So, again, like Michelle was saying, we're going to give you those action steps, activities that you can take with you, and then creating a plan again for implementing.
All right, the next one is concrete support in times of need. So when you have a child diagnosed with a disability, very often you're thrown into a lot of different things that cause stress and anxiety, right? You have to learn all these new systems of care. You have to learn how to juggle sleep deprivation with doctor's appointments, with behaviors, with therapies, school IEPs, getting all texts, getting insurance. There's just a lot that happens that causes increased amounts of stress on caregivers. So when you see us caregivers and you're like, oh, they're stressed out. Yeah, we really are. And actually, studies have shown that caregivers have PTSD like symptoms. We have all of the biological characteristics as people who come back from the war zone. So we are sleep deprived, we are on edge. They do have a lot of anxiety. And what happens as a result of this is that the children suffer because the caregivers are not being cared for or looked after, right? So we know that there's an increased likelihood of abuse and neglect amongst children who have disabilities. In fact, it's about 4 times higher than their typically developing peers. We also know that kids with disabilities are more likely to enter into the foster system or end up in kinship care situations. And so, again, what we want to do is we want to encourage agencies, now that we know this, right? We know that this is a more vulnerable population. So, what we need to do is we need to be more proactive rather than reactive. If we know that there's a higher likelihood of abuse and neglect of these children by the hands of their caregivers, then what we need to do is we need to make sure that those caregivers are okay, right? And we need to become mandatory supporters, not mandatory reporters. So how do we support that caregiver to make sure that they don't go off the cliff, right? And that's what we do within this training is we talk about the importance of providing supporters for your caregivers, but also for your staff, because your staff is also probably stressed out. You guys handle a lot too, right? We talk a lot about what the mental state is of most of the parents that you're working with. We talk about what is important and why it is important that they have concrete support in times of need. Very often our support structures fall underneath us when we get a diagnosis just because they don't know how to support us, to be honest with you, right? So how can we connect? How can we help you connect with parents? How can we help you connect parents with other parents? How can we make sure that parents know who to call if they're having an emergency or if they need help, right? How can we get you to recognize when parents are stressed out and then give you the resources to help them overcome that stress? And so that's a lot about what we do with this, how you can build in activities with the parents, how you can build that sense of community with the parents, and how you can provide support structures for the caregivers that you're working with so that they know that they're not alone and isolated, and that they have actually people and organizations in their life that can help them through the difficult times. And that's what we do when we do the training in concrete support of time in times of need.
The next one we're going to go over is the child's social and emotional competence. What do I mean when I say social and emotional competence? We want to help children become more capable of handling life's challenges socially and emotionally as they grow. This might seem like it's obvious, but what happens in the disability community is that we have so much support around that child from wonderful providers like yourselves, from families to every different therapy you could think of, to all of the things that surround a child after they get a diagnosis, that they're not really taught how to handle life's challenges socially or emotionally as much as their non-disabled peers. So we really want to try and build that into the family's repertoire so they know how to do that. So this is kind of a pyramid model to give you guys an overview. At the base of this model, we have positive relationships and supportive environments. So we want to create a healthy environment for them to be able to do things like embrace disability culture, finding a way to communicate, even if they are nonverbal, right? Finding a way that they can have communication and express themselves. Dignity of risk is an independent living principle that supports this positive relationship building really well. And what this means is that people with disabilities have the same right to take a risk and succeed or take a risk and fail, just like everyone else. And oftentimes in these supportive environments, we don't even do it on purpose, but we shelter children from failure, right? So we want to talk about how to be more supportive while still encouraging these opportunities for growth and taking risks. Seeing people with disabilities at work, right? Like if you are a disability centric organization, people with disabilities should be working there. People with disabilities should be the ones making decisions and talking about day to day operations. And so children with disabilities can come in and see a positive outlook for their future. And then focusing on true happiness. This one, like dignity of risk, is a little bit of my soapbox. So you'll hear a lot more about this in the full training for this module. But basically, what we mean here is there's the tendency when there's a child with a disability to redefine what we mean by happy. So if someone has a child who's not disabled and they say, I want them to be happy, what does that include? That includes contributing to their society. That includes meaningful relationships. That includes doing things that they're passionate about. That includes intimate relationships. All of these things that we put in what we consider a fulfilled life. And then when we get a disability diagnosis, happy suddenly switches to safe and content, right? So we want to help make that shift back to true happiness and give them the things that they deserve. And you guys, as organizations, are the first stop to doing that. This next part looks at the social emotional teaching strategies. So we'll go into the developmental milestones, the zones of regulation that I'm sure you guys are familiar with. Stepping Stones Triple P is a course that we also teach families on managing family dynamics and misbehavior. So we really try to give the concrete strategies that help do this. And then lastly, intensive support for those who need it. So whether this is one-on-one consultations or counseling services, support groups run by counselors myself and a colleague. One of the really great things about Care for the Caregivers is that we sponsor counseling models that are either counselors with disabilities or counselors who are caregivers of someone with a disability. So we can really understand that experience from a different viewpoint that can be really helpful. In this, we will kind of go more in depth into defining what social and emotional competence is, understanding that pyramid model that I just went over, and giving you those strategies. Empathy versus sympathy. So, not necessarily feeling sorry that someone has a disability, but empathizing with how those emotions can be difficult. And then again, you'll leave with activities and a plan.
The last protective factor discusses social connections and the importance of having social connections between people within this community. So I thought it was really kind of fascinating because at the beginning of the pandemic, right, we had this great social experiment that happened. Everybody had to go into isolation for like 2 weeks. And then, we kind of kept strictly isolated for a while afterwards. And what happened? I mean, people lost their minds. Like, people struggled so hard being isolated just for those 2 weeks. I remember seeing news articles and interviews, and people were like, I can't believe I have to stay home, and I can't take my kid to the grocery store, and I can't see my friends, and I can't go into the office, and we're just home. What I want you guys to understand is that this is how a lot of caregivers live for years. For years, they live in this kind of isolation. We have been at events and we have had caregivers come up to us and say, I feel like I have been doing this alone for 13 years, is what we had someone come up and say to us. So, this feeling of being completely isolated and on your own is something that a majority of caregivers feel, especially in those first beginning months when they feel like they don't have anybody to talk to who can relate to the experience that they are going through. So we think it is extremely important that caregivers be around other caregivers. And we think that it's important that caregivers should be around other caregivers within their child's disability and outside of their child's disability. Sometimes I feel like I won the disability lottery. I'm sorry for saying it like that, because both of my kids have autism. There are so many organizations that are in existence for parents and caregivers who have kiddos with autism. But what about those parents who have kids with rare genetic conditions or who don't fit into a certain box of a kind of a disability, right? We want to make sure that caregivers can talk to and relate to people across disability as a whole, not just within their silo, so that they can share resources with each other. And I can tell you, being a parent who has resources and being able to share it with somebody else who maybe doesn't because they live outside of the autism community, it is empowering for me personally to be able to share and help somebody else. So by helping and building these connections with other caregivers, you're giving them support, but you're also empowering them by allowing them to share what they know with others. And another thing is that caregivers should be around adults with disabilities. We as caregivers should be interacting with adults with autism, adults with cerebral palsy. We should have these people as a part of our lives and a part of our children's lives too. So, how do we enable caregivers in our group to be around adults with disabilities? And I know Gabby touched on this a little bit, but having people within your organization who are disabled is one easy way. There's a person who lets them in the morning and checks them in. Does that person have a disability? Can that caregiver see, again, that person with a disability and know, hey, you know what, my kiddo is going to be okay. There's somebody who looks just like them working at this place where we're getting services from them, right? So we should not only be around caregivers who are caregivers of children like our children, but caregivers who are caregivers of other kids who have disabilities. And we should also be interacting with people who have disabilities and are adults. We also think that it's important that our children, interact with other children within the disability community. Again, inside their disability and outside of their disability. My kids have autism, but we go to Ability 360 and they participate in their swim program. And in doing that, right, they're seeing that they're a part of this disability community that is not only full of people with autism, but people with cerebral palsy, people who are blind, people who have lost limbs, right? And they're seeing that they're part of something much bigger than their siloed off community. And so we would just love to encourage that you provide opportunities for the kids to meet and get together with kids within the disability and outside of their disability so that we build a community of children who grow into adults who are proud to be a part of this larger community as a whole. So for social connections, we will get into further detail about why parents are more isolated when they're raising a child with a disability than when they're not. Understanding the values of connecting parents in a variety of different ways, just to make sure that you're stemming that sense of isolation that they feel and helping them to create different social supports. We will discuss at least 3 ways you can encourage parents to make these connections. And then again, we'll leave you with a plan that you can put into place to help you help the caregivers develop friendships outside of what you're doing within your organization. So at the end of the protective factors training, what we really do is we go over a variety of strategies and everyday actions that organizations can take to strengthen families and hopefully reduce the likelihood of abuse and neglect. So down here on the bottom, you can see the 5 different protective factors that we cover in the training: parental resilience, social connection, knowledge of parenting and childhood development, concrete support in times of need, social emotional competence of children. Above that, you'll see everyday actions that we help you establish to accomplish the goal of strengthening that protective factor. And then at the top, you can see different strategies that we will help you employ to strengthen families. And that is what this training is all about. Gabby, do you want to say anything here?
I just want to point out that all of these are really well connected to the other, right? So they all play on each other really well. But if there is a specific one that you feel like relates to your organization more or speaks more to what you guys do in the community, you don't have to do all 5 to benefit from the training. So we can customize it in whatever way works for you or your organization.
Yep. And each of these trainings is about 2 hours long. We can do them online or we can do them in person. And thanks to a continued grant from the Arizona Developmental Division Planning Council, we can offer these for free to your organization. If you're interested in learning more and getting protective factors training, you can either scan this QR code and just email us, or you can email me at mthorn@careforthecaregivers.org, and we can start the process of getting your organization trained in the protective factors training.
Thank you guys.
Thank you all for coming. I hope that this was informative and helpful to you as you continue to serve families and the disability community. Thank you for watching.